we're going to continue to work together and care for all of our friends in the interfaith community. So together, today we bring, I can be on screen this way. Hi, everyone online.
There she is.
Good, I'm glad that you got your links. Very good. So today we bring together not only our three institutions, but also Mishkan Chicago and Isma, Shema Consulting for this important discussion. And I'm also going to turn it over to our friend Nina Fernando from Shoulder to Shoulder Campaign. She's going to be our moderator, and she's a friend to all of us. I just also want to mention quickly that we are having some photographs taken. If that is uncomfortable for anyone, just let us know, and we won't use those photos for any publicity, but in general, we want to make sure that we remember this. And now I will turn it over to Nina. Thank you so much for being here and for moderating.
Hello, it's really good to be with you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, very loud. Let's see if we can get it on.
Okay. Well, I will just start, and please stop me if you need me to repeat. Well, I am really grateful to be with you all today, and I want to give special thanks to the organizers, especially Sarah Trum, Romana Mansour, and Kim Schultz, and their respective institutions. The Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, the Interreligious Institute at Chicago Theological Seminary, and American Islamic College, and to our speakers today, which I am very excited to introduce. Marium Mohiuddin from Isma Shema Consulting, along with her colleague, Dr. Zack Ritter of Isma Shema Consulting. Rabbi Philp, the Associate Rabbi at Mishkan, Chicago, and Dr. Timothy Gianotti, the President of America Islamic College. Thank you all for joining and being a part of this conversation. I want to take a quick moment and introduce myself. My name is Nina Fernando. I'm the Executive Director of the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. And Shoulder to Shoulder envisions a pluralistic United States where all people, regardless of their faith or identity, are treated with dignity and respect. That's our very core. And we reach that vision through our mission. We connect, we equip, and we mobilize people of faith and goodwill to counter and prevent anti-Muslim discrimination in the United States. And especially in moments of crisis like this, it's essential to help connect the dots to other forms of bigotry and discrimination, including anti-Jewish, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian hate and discrimination, knowing that we all have a role to play. And what makes Shoulder to Shoulder unique among an ecosystem of organizations doing this work to counter anti-Muslim discrimination is that our primary audience are people of faith and goodwill, primarily those beyond the Muslim community, to do this work of understanding and countering anti-Muslim discrimination. And really the core of that is that all these issues, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian, it's not just an issue that impacts those communities, it impacts all of us. And again, can't say enough, we all have a role to play. I am neither Muslim or Jewish myself. I come from a Christian upbringing. And really what is important to me is how our faith motivates us to make change. And whether that faith is rooted in a tradition or if it's just in the understanding of a hope and a possibility of what this world can be, it's a powerful motivator to make change. So before we dive into the conversation and hear from our speakers, I want to recognize the pain and the trauma and the weight of all that is this moment. The contentious United States elections that are just around the corner in the midst of this incomprehensible death and suffering of war. There's so many of us here in the United States who have been impacted. And this event title, How Do We Find the Words? Interfaith Engagement in Troubling Times. It's a real question that we're all grappling with. How do we find the words? Words are powerful, they carry weight. They also change over time, you know, and sometimes there are no words. They also can create whole worlds, you know, with the words that we use. I want to name, the limitations of words, even just the terms Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. They have their limits.
Nina, can I just interrupt for one moment and ask
Yes.
that you check your microphone and make sure it's all the way up? We can't do it any louder in here. And
Okay.
it's hearable, but if you're all of the presenters online, make sure your volume is all the way up. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Is this making a difference at all?
Helps a little, not much, but go ahead.
Okay. Let me see if I can do anything here on the back end. Does that make a difference?
Yeah, a little
Here we
bit.
go. Testing, testing.
Yeah.
Does that make a difference?
Working on it at our end as well. You can keep going.
Okay, I moved it up. Well, I hope that makes a difference.
Yeah.
So going back to words, I want to name that we can't deny the real challenges of interfaith engagement in this time. And it's really challenging to share space with people who see the world in radically different ways than we do, who are getting their information about what is happening in this moment from totally different platforms. And speaking strategically, just for myself, coming from a faith community organizing background, I firmly believe this. If we only talk to people who agree with us and are on the same page, how do we expect to make change? So preparing for our speakers, Marium, Zack, Dr. Timothy, and Rabbi Stephen, I want to just emphasize a few points. We're not going to put the burden on them to represent all Muslims and all Jews. We also want to acknowledge the voices that are not here, including those who are Palestinian, Israeli, Lebanese, Sudanese. The list goes on of those who are directly impacted and are feeling the heavy weights of all that is this moment. And I also want to name, we won't make any assumptions that all of us here are in agreement on every issue and that we'll solve all the problems of the world in this one conversation. What we will do is assume a posture of humility. We will recognize that we are imperfect human beings. We won't get everything right, and we'll give ourselves and each other the grace when we inevitably make mistakes, recognizing that we're each learning and growing and changing every day on our own journeys. So to dive in and welcome in our speakers to the conversation, this moment does feel unprecedented in many ways, but we also have to recognize that we've been here before in our society. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism didn't start on October 7th, for example. There's a long history of human beings othering fellow human beings, creating these us versus them narratives and committing harm against one another. So I want to invite Marium and Zack to share a little of what you think is important for people to understand about the histories of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Because I turned up my mic, so I figured out how to do it. Zack, I don't know if you want to test as well.
Hello, hello. Mic check, mic check.
So if you don't mind, I just want to share a few slides because there's a lot of information, as you know, with history that we can share. So Zack and I do a lot of presentations on the history of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And one of the reasons we focus on history is because to know and understand what's happening today, we need to know and understand what happened in the past. And that a lot of what we're experiencing today has been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But many people ask us, like, why do you do this together? And why don't you do it separately and give each one its own right, its own care? But we find that as one form of bigotry rises, so does other forms. And that's what we're seeing right now. It's known as a rising tide of hate. And we think it's really important for these two communities to present together is because we do share a history of prejudice. and we do have interconnected narratives. We are trying to, by instead of being divisive, is trying to bring us together so that we can promote understanding and really strengthen solidarity. But I find also that to dismantle any kind of systems of hate, I can't do it on my own. And I do need my allies, and I do need people with me. So to say that, we were, there's so much that you can say about history of Islamophobia, and we tried to boil this down as much as we can. So these are 5 points that we thought were really essential for people to know about what we're facing today. Starting with the Crusades. And so I know when I talk about this, I always reference different movies about it. And so people might be familiar with it in that respect. Someone had mentioned Monty Python yesterday to me, and I was like, yep, that's the Crusades. But it established one of the earliest and most influential narratives about who Muslims are and stereotypes. And from there, colonialism and the empire, during the colonial period, Western empires expanded into a lot of Muslim majority countries. By 1914, 80% of the world was colonized by 8% of the world. So you can see the influence on all these countries, and what's happening in Europe today and how they're facing Islamophobia has a direct line to which state or which nation was colonizing which nations. The colonial powers portrayed Muslims as uncivilized, using these stereotypes to really just justify domination. From that, we move on to the third point, and you should read this book if you haven't had a chance to. It's Orientalism by Edward Said. This picture that's up here is actually from his cover, and I think is really telling about what he's trying to get across. And the concept of Orientalism is the West's depiction of the Orient fostered on like us, the West's depiction of us. Muslims were often portrayed as irrational or threatening or violent and very sexualized, exotic, erotic. I have a slide that I usually show about movies. You can see this so readily in movies. From one of the best examples I can think of from my childhood being Aladdin, and how Princess Jasmine was portrayed, to just when I moved here to California, so many of my friends, Muslim actor friends that I met, the positions that they played or the characters they played were like terrorist one or terrorist two. And it was this unfortunate thing about how we're feeding into this. The last two, the fourth one is racialization of Muslims. And this is something that's really come up recently, and I felt it a lot, that Muslims are discriminated of how we look or our appearance or our ethnicities, that there's this one monolith of this is how we are, when actually there's 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, and pretty much in every single country. I know growing up in Texas, people used to say to me, well, you don't look Muslim, or are you a cool Muslim? And then when I did start wearing hijab, things became very different in how people treated me. But speaking of that, I'm a former journalist, and so I was in the newsroom during 9/11, and the war on terror and everything that's followed in the past 23 years has been absolutely horrible and horrific. And we've just seen such an increase on just not even surveillance, discrimination, hate crimes. And it's unfortunate because that's something that Zack and I share and we're talking about. So I'm actually going to turn it over to him if you want to talk about the anti-Semitism points.
Yeah, just yesterday we were giving a presentation together, Marium and I, and we both realized when we were young at a respective temple and mosque, we saw red paint or what appeared to be pig's blood or something thrown on the front of the Jewish temple and the Muslim mosque, and so we unfortunately had that shared memory as children of this kind of hate crime. So where I teach at UCLA and I teach history and social justice issues. So where does all this hate kind of stem from, of anti-Semitism? Not to mention that Semite comes from Shem, which is the son of Noah, and Semite applies to both Arabs and Jews. But we often say anti-Semitism, we mean Jewish hate. Early Christian period, both Islam and Judaism, unfortunately, at times are pitted against white Christian Europe. And so this notion of Jews killed Jesus and deicide, which is false. The Romans killed Jesus, but it is blamed. The scapegoat is the Jews. And so this makes it easy to demonize and then push out or kill Jewish folks from different countries in Europe. We know the expulsion in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue from Spain and also kicked out all the Muslims and Jews from Spain, which starts, a bigger diaspora of Muslims and Jews also to the New World. Blood libel in the Middle Ages, this crazy notion that oh Lord, that Jews killed Christian babies and took their blood to make the matzah cracker. Folks, it's just a cracker. You don't need blood to make a cracker. So this is another way of demonizing Jewish folks. And we also see these stereotypes and myths, conspiracy theories being reproduced and recycled in QAnon theories and other, pedophilia issues, conspiracy theories in modern day politics, which is highly unfortunate. And then, I was reading the other day that even in the Holocaust, yes, outwardly, Hitler spoke positively about Islam and called it very militant and called it politically savvy, and that the prophet was politically savvy and things like this. But we know there was at least 58 people on the records that were murdered in Auschwitz that were Muslim, and that the Nazis had their satellite fascist governments that killed 300 Bosnian Muslims. And so the hate towards Muslims and Jews, obviously 6 million Jews killed. Roma folks were also Muslim. Certain Roma groups were Muslim. So it wasn't, let's just say the Nazis were not discriminating against who they discriminated against and who they killed. And I should say, lastly, in a modern age, our media is focusing a lot on what's going on college campuses, obviously with the rising hate in terms of Muslims and Jews, and terrible things of people getting, bottles smashed on their head if they're wearing a yarmulke, or students having to tuck away their Jewish star, but also folks having to take off their hijab or being scared to appear, Muslim in public, because then someone's going to say you're a terrorist, or if someone has a Jewish star, they're going to say that you are somehow complicit with the Netanyahu government and you are in lockstep with the IDF, which is not the case. And one thing I think is really important to highlight here is when the terrible killings at the Tree of Life happened in Pittsburgh, the killer that shot all those Jewish folks was feeding off of the great replacement theory that Muslims and Jews and black folks and brown folks and Asian folks are all in cahoots with each other to kill white Christians and replace them and do a white Christian genocide. And that temple was funding HIAS, which brought my father to this country. And HIAS was helping Muslim immigrants come to this country with Jewish support. And the Muslim community raised $200,000 to help with the funeral arrangements for all the Jewish folks who got murdered at the Tree of Life. So there are these moments of beautiful solidarity in the face of tragedy that is oftentimes left out of our public discourse, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thank you both for giving us that historical context to the issues. I want to bring it into the current context and invite Dr. Timothy and Rabbi Stephen to share. Tell us about the impact of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia here and now. How are American Jewish and American Muslim communities experiencing all that is this moment? How have you, as leaders at your synagogue and at your Islamic university, navigating this time?
First, I want to just thank you all for having me here, having us here, and engaging in what is a very important but also very difficult conversation. I'll admit, feeling some trepidation walking into a space like this. This is a time of incredibly high tension in our country, in our communities. I'm sure we are all keenly aware of the election that we're tumbling toward, which has taken, I feel, both Muslim and Jewish pain, and has instrumentalized it in very dangerous ways. And so I'll speak from my own perspective, right? Understanding, as Nina mentioned earlier, none of our communities are monolithic, and I'm just but one voice out of many millions around the world. The Jewish community is a multinational, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multiracial people. And I'm just but one person in that mix. So with that as the background, I think there's a feeling right now that Jewish pain is not being taken seriously. And what I mean by that is that, particularly on the right in this country, it's being utilized for political gain. We see the ways that Jewish pain is being co-opted and used to try to drive a wedge between the Jewish community and communities that we've traditionally been in collaboration, alignment, coalition with, sometimes uncomfortable coalition, but coalition nonetheless. And we see on the left, which is for many Jews, not all, but for many Jews, our natural political and social home, that our pain is not being treated as real. It's being questioned, it's being denied. I think one of the best and probably most painful examples of this, although there are many, is very shortly after the events of October 7th, having accounts of gender-based violence be questioned or even denied as propaganda. And how incredibly painful that was for us as a people who have often found ourselves in alignment with those very kind of organizations that would normally step up and stand for the victims' voices in that moment. And that's just one of many, many examples. The difficulty that I have found, particularly as a communal leader, is in order for us to be able to access our own pain and utilize it as a point of empathy and connection with other communities, which is a fundamental call of the Jewish tradition, right? We know the soul of the stranger because we were strangers ourselves. To be able to access that, it's so much harder to do that when that heartbreak, that loss is being denied from the outright. And I am sure that this is an experience that has also been experienced by other communities that are impacted so heavily in this moment. It shuts down the conversation to walk into a space and say, you know, I don't see your heartbreak, or it's not real, or it's not as bad, or it's not as, all the qualifiers that come with that. I'm sure we've heard that, not just for the Jewish community, but again, speaking from my particular perspective. And so that leads to, I think, this kind of feeling of isolation, of rupture in relationships that we've relied on for so long, of doors being closed that we are used to having open between our communities. And it plays into, I think, some of our worst tendencies when we are wounded and then we have somebody tell us that our wounds aren't real, is to then turn inward and to actually build the walls a little higher, to seek out those who validate us, which are often also the voices that help us create echo chambers of information and echo chambers of our own kind of self-righteousness. And it's hard to see that happen internally in the Jewish community, and it's hard to see that happen really, I mean, I think, again, as we head towards this election cycle, across communities that we're turning inward precisely at the moment when, Zack highlighted a moment in which our communities turn outward toward each other in tragedy and actually help lift each other up. And I'll pause there.
This is, as many people have already said, this is a heavy conversation to be having. It's a heavy moment to be inhabiting. I'm grateful to Rabbi Stephen and to Zack and Marium and Nina and to the Lutheran School of Theology and the Chicago Theological Seminary, and for my own school, the American Islamic College, for sponsoring this event. That said, I have to say that I'm here against the counsel of many of my faculty members and many people within my community who feel that even having a discussion while the carnage and the wholesale, the industrial scale slaughter of primarily Muslims in the Middle East is ongoing. And we woke up this morning to news that hundreds more have died, and have died as a result of weapons that our own country and tax dollars are supplying. And so I have many people within my community that have protested against my participation here today. So it's not just a difficult conversation between us, it's a difficult conversation even within our own communities, because we live in a moment that is so polarized. People have said, we're so concerned that the world isn't hearing our pain and seeing our pain that we've just become completely polarized. I stand with Israel, or I stand with the Palestinian people, and no one seems to be just standing for the sanctity of the human being. So the Quran and the rabbinical tradition both teach that the killing of a single soul unjustly is tantamount to killing all of humanity. And the saving of a single soul, a single human life, not a Muslim life or a Jewish life, but the saving of a single soul is tantamount to saving all of humanity. So even with the violence that's being perpetrated right now and the dehumanization that's being perpetrated right now, while the world watches as if it's a spectator sport, if our conversation today can lead to a single person being treated more humanely, or to a single person's pain being taken seriously, then to me it's worth all of the pushback that I'm going to receive and have already received for being here today. Because I believe that even in these moments of incredible inhumanity, we need to find the words, even when the words are difficult to find. And just to give you a context, right? So the college that I serve as president, the American Islamic College, there are vendors in the city of Chicago that will not do business with us because we're Muslims. I just received another report yesterday that the vendors, even our director of security, vendors that he worked with quite regularly when he was working for Cook County, have told him, no, we don't want the American Islamic College, we don't want your business. So there are people who have refused to work with us even in this city of Chicago. And of course, we all know by looking at the reports that come to us from overseas that there are certain lives that are fully humanized. We hear from their uncles and their brothers and their parents, and we learn about the fact that they loved karate, or they loved playing piano or playing violin. And then there are tens of thousands of people who are just numbers, brown numbers, Muslim numbers. We don't hear from their teachers. We don't hear from their parents, if their teachers and parents are still alive. We don't hear we don't hear about what they love to do, what their hobbies were. So they're not humanized, right? The many layers of a human life are stripped from them because of their ethnic identity or their religious identity. And so the world doesn't grieve, doesn't mourn them. And we know that even very socially responsible, peace-loving Muslim politicians were denied a platform at the Democratic Congress. I'm not to be disrespectful to any political group here, because that's not what we're about. But just to see that no matter who gets elected, the Muslims are going to lose because we don't count. Our voices don't count. Our deaths are not humanized. And so we need to journey to a place where we can hold each other's pain. And we need to be willing to place ourselves in uncomfortable situations where even if we're just grieving together, two bearded white men who are totally not representative of the communities that we serve, right? Two bearded white men grieving over a cup of coffee. Hopefully it's fair trade coffee. But even if that's all we do, then I think we need to do it. And it's true that many of the people whose vision of America, even right here at home, does not include Muslims or an Islamic college, there's a good chance that their vision of America also doesn't include you. synagogues. And that's why, it's the very fact that we see armed guards outside of every synagogue on Friday nights and Saturday mornings is already evidence of the fact that we're living within a traumatized and traumatizing world, a violent world. The week of October 7th, I was scheduled to give a talk at the Western University in Ontario, Canada. Yes, there are universities north of the border. So I was scheduled to give a talk on the centrality of rahmah, of mercy and love within an Islamic environment. And that was scheduled long before October 7th happened. And I was riding a train from Toronto to Windsor, Ontario, or London, Ontario, where Western University is located. And there was a girl sitting next to me, and she answered the phone and she said, "Yeah, Dad, I'm okay. It's okay. I'm safe. I'm just on the train and I'm going and I won't go to the vigil tonight if on campus if it's unsafe. Don't worry, Dad." So she hung up the phone, and here I am, like a bearded Muslim sitting across from her, and I said, I waited, obviously, because I didn't want to frighten her. But I heard that she had a cat with her, as I remember, and I said, we started talking about the cat, and then I said, I don't mean to frighten you, but I heard you say that you're not feeling safe, and so I'm just guessing that you're Jewish and you're going back to campus. And she said, "Yeah," and I said, "I just want you to know that as a Muslim, it's not okay. It's not okay with me that you're not safe, that you don't feel safe, and that this is already a form of violence which is being done to you because obviously, the people that broke out of the incarcerated open-air prison of Gaza, after, many of whom were probably not from Gaza, but they were refugees from 1948 who were in the open-air prison of Gaza and had been living with years. They were born in a state of incarceration and a state of occupation. And so nothing began on October 7th, obviously, but those people who broke out and did, vicious acts against people who were not responsible for their suffering, that this was not acceptable. And the chance of those people attacking a group of Jewish students at University of Western Ontario, so remote. But just the very fact that you're not feeling safe is not okay with me. And I just want you to know, and I want your family to know, that there are Muslims here who will stand for you and will stand against the violence which makes you feel unsafe. And it turns out she was like a social justice major at the University of Western Ontario, and she was totally up to date with regard to the history of Palestinian suffering, and she understood. So she was totally plugged in. We had a great conversation, but I think it's important that we understand that our communities will not be safe until we're willing to stand for one another. And this is not a moment for standing for any nation state and its policies if they violate the core principles of our religious teachings. And it's not the moment for justifying actions which are outside the realm of moral and ethical laws within our traditions. But it's also not the moment to demonize human beings who are responding to their experiences in ways that are unhealthy and harmful. We live in a traumatized world, and we live in a traumatizing world, but somehow, some way, we have to therapeutically put an end to the trauma and to identify these behaviors as being expressions of trauma. And the very fact that after having been completely destroyed, northern Gaza is under bombardment again just boggles my mind. And the very fact that the world is watching this happen, and today we're not talking about the Palestinian situation, but I think we need to understand that the Muslim community feels that dehumanization, feels that these lives don't matter, that these deaths are nameless deaths. They're in the hundreds and the thousands and the tens of thousands. And the missing and the buried under the rubble, we don't even know what the numbers are. But we don't know their names. We don't know their families because they haven't been humanized in the way this has been brought to us. So we're living in a situation where I think going forward, our interfaith engagement, our interfaith encounters can only work if we come to the table as full human beings. And there have been so many events in the past, you know, and maybe because I'm an academic or because I'm white or somehow, some way I've been perceived as a safe Muslim. I get these calls. Yeah, you know, we've got this interfaith situation all set up. I've got the Christian speakers and the Muslim speakers. It's all done. All you have to do is show up. We need a Muslim. Right? That's not taking the humanity of my community seriously. That's not like that. That's not what we need. What we need is a moment. We need contexts, these safe spaces in which we can come to the table as full human beings. And the world is not affording that space right now. The news, the media is not affording that space right now. The election platforms are not affording that space right now. We're being told by both of the major parties that we really don't matter. That our experience, our pain, our suffering, and what's going on in the world today really doesn't matter. Because our lives don't count. I was told by a colleague, and I'll end with this, after 9/11. This was the reason why we left. Actually, we packed up and moved and left a tenure track position. But a scholar colleague who was chair of the promotion and tenure committee in that university at the time, after 9/11, started treating me in very, very vile and profane and aggressive ways. And I thought it was because my book had just come out and I hadn't given him a copy of my book. And so I even ruined one of my precious books. And I gave it to him. I said, you know, I'd like you to have this, you know, in appreciation for our relation. I thought it was something I had done. And when I went into his office, he said, look, he says, I'm trying my best to tolerate you. Don't speak to me. You're right. If I have to be on a committee with you, I'll endure it, but I don't want to speak to you. I don't want to have anything to do with you. And I said, you know, you've been to my house for dinner. And I've been to your house for dinner. You know, and it's clear that I was hired with the assumption that with a name like Timothy Gianotti, I was a Catholic who was a scholar of Islam. And they were like, it was a terrible surprise for them when they realized that I actually went to the local mosque and was more than just a scholar, a Catholic scholar who studied this stuff. But when I said, you know, we've been to one another's homes for dinner, you've met my family. I said, how can you treat me in such a dehumanizing way? And he said it would only be dehumanizing if you were human to begin with. Get out of my office. And so I went on the job market, found a tenure track position in a super liberal part of the country, and we moved. Because it wasn't any longer, it wasn't a safe space in my department. Didn't think that there was anything wrong with the exchanges that were going on. We have to refuse to live in a world like that. And in order for us to have meaningful conversations, I think it has to start with me recognizing your full humanity and all the diverse peoples that somehow crazily, weirdly you represent as a white man. And the same has to be true for me. And so I think it begins by us grieving over one another's deaths. It has to begin with me acknowledging that something terrible and traumatizing has been done by people, admittedly, by people who are already traumatized. And the response, this overwhelming industrial scale, murderous response, is also an expression of trauma. Can't be understood in any other way in my mind. And so we need to begin by mourning one another's, we sharing or me trying my best to feel your pain. But that has to be reciprocal. Otherwise, we're just gonna eat falafel and go home unchanged. And the world will be no better for whatever kind of interfaith dialogue we experience. So these are heavy days, these are heavy words. I'm not feeling lighter for having shared them. But I do feel a sense of grit and determination and hope that somehow, some way, we can make a difference.
I know we have more questions, but you're reminding me very, very quickly that, you know, thinking of this as a story of two traumatized peoples and communities, and the ways in which trauma can push us to project our pain onto others, to lash out, right? To build those walls higher, to seek out what feels threatening and destroy it, right? And to understand this interplay, particularly in Israel and Palestine, of these trauma reactions, but then to also, you're reminding me of the way that trauma, if we are able to hold it and to recognize it, to honor it, to understand where it comes from, can be exactly the thing that helps us then look at each other and say, wait, I see that part of you as well, right? That my pain actually is resonating with your pain. And we have extraordinary examples of this. I always think of the Parent Circle Family Forum, right? Palestinian and Israeli Jews who've lost loved ones in the past 75 years, and are using their pain as a moment of connection and saying, I'm actually not going to blame and point fingers and lash out. I'm going to say that this cycle ends here, and I'm going to use my pain to see your pain and come together. And you reminded me with your story of being on the train. The only two non-Jewish people who reached out to me on October 7th were my two Palestinian friends. And on one hand, it's remarkable, and on the other hand, it makes absolute sense that those would be the two people from outside the Jewish community who would reach out, because those are two people who say, I understand this pain because it resonates with my own. It may not be the exact same, but that is the bridge that connects us in this moment. And I think our brokenness can be a reason to shut others out, but our brokenness can also be exactly that which allows us to connect with one another and in a really incredible way, and to begin to change the narrative, albeit very slowly and in small spaces like this. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this rich sharing. I think what really, really sticks out to me is this value of human dignity and how much we need to center ourselves on this value and what that means in all the many different spaces. It means not silencing or erasing the pain of each other. It means showing up in all that we are and all that we believe rather than water it down. It means, and dealing with those differences, dealing with the tensions of those differences. It means recognizing our privilege as well, I want to say, and how some of us have more depending on the context, and how we use that privilege to change the dynamics and to recognize each other and to recognize those that are not in our spaces. So I really, really appreciate this sharing. I want to move us to thinking about words. You know, this notion of, you know, how do we find the words, and also how words can trigger responses. It can, you know, bring about those traumas and the pain and the grief. It can be defined in radically different ways. So I want to bring in Marium and Zack to talk a little bit about those charged words.
Yeah. So during our presentations, our workshops, we focus on some trigger terms, because we know that when we have conversations, just like the two mentioned, sometimes our traumas and our pains can come out just by one word. And so we have a bunch of words on the screen here. And also we go to a lot of colleges, corporations, and nonprofits. And sometimes people don't know some of the basics of, you know, what is BDS, or what is Nakba, or what is Intifada. And so we go and we define them, and then we say, you know, this to this when there is only one solution, Intifada revolution is a chant that we hear sometimes on college campuses. And to some, right, that means liberation, uprising, and changing of the status quo. And then to others' ears, they hear, oh God, the first Intifada and the second Intifada resulted in, hundreds of Israelis' death and thousands of Palestinian death. And so is this going to be violent? Am I safe on this campus? What does this mean for my body, my friends' bodies, etc.? And then some folks, they don't know where is the West Bank, what is Palestine. It's not designated as a country, by the international community yet. And so we try to get at these complicated things that sometimes folks don't know. And then language is always changing because IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, online culture has changed this a little bit. And so critics of the IDF sometimes now use IOF, which is Israeli Offensive Forces, to say that it's actually not defensive, but that there's too much death and too much killing. And so they're changing the lexicon. So we just wanted to share with you some of these trigger terms that could be triggering even in your own conversations, and you may not even know that from the river to the sea was a chant that even goes back to Jabotinsky and kind of the militancy of an early Zionist movement that said we want the river to the sea all for Jewish folks. And then we know with Yasser Arafat in the 1960s and 70s, from the river to the sea, some interpreted it as, Palestinian folks want to push out all the Jewish folks into the Mediterranean Sea, right, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And so this is a chant that has been bandied about and used by various sides for political reasons.
So let me add to that. This list is not exhaustive. There's so many more words that you could think of, and we're always welcoming to add to this. But we've chosen these because this is what's come up a lot in conversation. And even when we're having these conversations, people will say, well, why is this? That's not triggering for me. And then that's in essence what we're talking about. So Zack had mentioned from the river to the sea. And I just wanted to share a story about that, is that I had posted something early on back in 2023 about what that meant to me. And a Jewish friend of mine DM'd me and told me she expressed what it meant to her, and that it meant something. What she meant annihilation, and she felt very scared for her daughters, and taking them to school was really scary. And so she expressed this to me. We went back and forth, and we had this conversation, and it was really helpful because I do stand where I stand with my definition and my understanding of it. And I've tried to explain that to people, but I also understand that by removing some words from conversations, I can have a conversation and I can show more or talk about more things. And so knowing and understanding trigger terms is really important because it does encourage that safe dialogue and that productive learning. And even just like hearing from her about how she felt, it was interesting because I hadn't personalized it that much. And so building that empathy and sympathy, sensitivity. So anyways, these are just things that we have come across and wanted to share.
Thank you. Thank you. And so Dr. Timothy and Rabbi Stephen, how have your communities been processing all of these words, these contested definitions, all the generational traumas, the realities of really receiving news and our social media, coming from radically different angles and perspectives? What do you make of it? How do we cut through to see one another's pain, but also to recognize the differences? They are interconnected and they are distinct and showing up differently. How have you been navigating that?
The words that I'm hearing within the Muslim community are genocide, classic case of ethnic cleansing, I'm hearing language which may be difficult for my Jewish brothers and sisters to hear. Words of exclusion, right? I just read yesterday about Harvard. There were some students who were silently protesting in the library, calling for a ceasefire, and they've been banned from the library for 2 weeks. And the faculty members that were supporting the students in that silent protest, non-disruptive protest, have also been banned from the library. And so it's being called the Palestine exception. So we believe in free speech, and we want our students and our children to engage with issues and to think critically and to live according to their consciences. But if it involves standing for Palestinian life and dignity, then we call the police, and the police take them to prison. So we've criminalized free speech when it goes against this political pendulum right now, which is in a very extreme place. And so, you know, what I'm hearing and what I'm experiencing within the Muslim community is, you know, are these precisely these kinds of words that are going to be difficult for someone who sees the situation differently and feels differently. And I also, you know, I get the AJC emails every day, and I see the constant redirection of attention to October 7th, which was bad and deplorable and beyond the scope of any kind of moral and ethical boundaries within Islam. But I see by redirecting attention to October 7th, then we're not paying attention to the thousands and tens of thousands of people who are being slaughtered. And I even, you know, I went to the funeral of Brother Wida when the Illinois boy who was stabbed to death, the Palestinian boy, and his mother too was stabbed, but she survived. I went to the funeral, and I found one rabbi there, one solitary rabbi there, who was standing in solidarity with the Palestinian and the Muslim community over this horrific act of senseless violence. And to me, that act is precisely the kind of discomfort that we need to be feeling and going into one another's spaces and standing for one another's grief and standing for a different way of being. And so I think that the words that I'm hearing within the Muslim community are not words that are going to be easy for anyone outside of the Muslim community to feel, unless we're talking about, you know, Palestinian Lebanese Christians and other brown folks who are experiencing the bombardment and the slaughter and the devastating losses of entire extended families in the same way.
What I hear from that is that there's this need for the world, for others to see this pain. This pain is not being acknowledged and not being uplifted. And I think that's a really powerful point to uplift, because that's actually what Rabbi Steve also uplifted at the beginning of this conversation. Do you have any to add, Rabbi Steve?
A few things. One is, I think, showing up in each of those spaces is so important. I was very proud, I think is the right word, that my colleague was at that funeral, representing our community, because it is so important to be in those spaces together, to show up even when it's uncomfortable. There's so much to say about words in this moment. One is that I think any of us, but I think particularly those of us in the Jewish and the Muslim community, need to be very, very wary when speech is curtailed. I'll speak from a Jewish perspective. Jews have not done well historically in places where free speech is curtailed, or, you know, the line between book burnings and us not doing well is a very thick and direct line. And I worry how the idea of Jewish safety, particularly on campuses in this moment, is being utilized as a political tool. I had the opportunity to sit down with different government officials a few weeks ago in DC, and as part of a fellowship that was part of it, the context is not necessarily important. And I was very frightened to hear officials from a particular party that is very close to coming into power talk about the idea of Jewish safety as a reason to defund public universities. And that is not good. I think most of us can agree that kind of utilization of the kind of veneer of using particular forms of free speech, the idea of using Jewish safety as a reason for attacking those institutions that actually help us maintain the safety of minority communities in this country is very, very dangerous. And I see the way that words are being used as a tool by people who I think in the end don't actually particularly care about Jewish safety or Muslim safety for that matter, although many of them are explicit about the lack of care on the latter side. I think speaking internally for our communities, because I think that's where we can have the most impact, we need to be willing to understand when words and terms that trigger us might have a different meaning for the person who's using them. So I think a curiosity to be able to interrogate when somebody uses a word that's hard for us to hear, a phrase that's hard for us to hear. The example that Marium brought up earlier for the friend reaching out to say, this term that you're using actually, it rings this way for me. This is what I hear when I hear that. And then also, on the flip side of that, to be able to understand when the words that we use, even if we understand them in a particular way, are impacting others or being perceived. So it's a balance. It's a curiosity on one hand to say, you're using the term intifada, for example. My association with the word intifada is I used to walk by a memorial to students at my rabbinical school who were killed in a bus bombing during the second intifada, right? So that's the association with the word in my mind. It's on me then when a friend of mine uses intifada in a positive or motivating or kind of forward-looking way to say, okay, like, what do you mean by this word? Because my association with this word says something completely different in this moment. And I want to understand what you're saying there. And then also, too, it's my responsibility then, if I'm using a particular word or a term, for example, the word Zionist, which has become such a triggering term in particular communities, to say, okay, for me, it means a particular thing. Let's say self-determination of Jewish people in our ancestral homeland. But for you, that word might be associated with the ongoing slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. And to be able to have that conversation, my problem, and I've seen this internally in the Jewish community, and so I'm sure it's true elsewhere, is that people will use the presence or lack of a single word as a way of disengaging or a reason for disengaging from each other. I have had folks walk away from me, from my community, because I haven't used a particular word they wanted to hear, or I used a word that they didn't want to hear. And then to cut the conversation off there. And I think that's so dangerous in this moment, to not have the curiosity to ask, to not have the grace to understand how words might impact differently, and to say, because you said occupation, because you said genocide, because you said Israel, right? That I'm actually gonna cut the conversation off there. Because then, going back to what I was saying earlier, then we retreat into these silos of people who use the same words as us, people who only speak in ways that don't challenge us, and the ability, even among the most discerning, caring, compassionate people, for more extreme ideas to emerge when we are in echo chambers that just reinforce our ideas. I mean, it's so dangerous. We are all susceptible to that. And the algorithms, they make it so much easier. They make it so much easier right now. I mean, to see the way that we are fed news that makes us feel really good and really self-righteous about what we believe, that we're on the right side of history. And to dismantle that, to at least have the I think, responsible kind of check to our own ego, even if it's coming from a very caring and hurt and heartbroken and feeling and compassionate place, to have the check to intake other information and hear other people's stories, we need to be able to tolerate words that trigger us, and we need to be able to have discussions around words that we feel are sacred, but might actually be triggering to other people as well.
Can I add something really quickly to what you were saying? Is that when you were talking about the words, how they impact us. And so Zach and I actually we saw Ta-Nehisi Coates speak this past Sunday and for his new book. And one thing he said that really struck me, and Zach, you probably could articulate better than I can, about the we've taken the humanity out of wording. And so we're using different kind of wordings that so you don't see the people in it anymore. And so these are how words have also changed too. So things like, I don't know, Zach, if you want to give the example that you were talking about yesterday.
Someone in the audience asked, "What is administrative detention?" And so it's a very sterilized, generic word, but then it's when Israeli intelligence can arrest someone without due process and can cause bodily harm to them and do harmful things to them. But it's called administrative detention. And then Ta-Nehisi Coates was saying how we used to call waterboarding enhanced interrogation. So an enhanced interrogation sounds copacetic and okay and good, but then we know waterboarding led to tremendous trauma and death in many cases.
I think also just to raise that point a little bit, like I think we also just need to be so careful about dehumanizing language. The language that's being used that casts broad brushstrokes on entire populations and makes them an other, I think it has a direct impact on our communities here. The young boy who was murdered just last year, a year ago this month, I think is a prime example of that. And right now, the Jewish community in Chicago is sitting with a lot of uncertainty. There was a Jewish man on his way to synagogue this last week who was approached from behind and shot in the shoulder. He is, thank God, okay. And I think connection between this is a room, I think, of thinking, feeling people, right? The connection between dehumanizing language and people feeling empowered to do those things is very clear. It's very, very clear.
Yeah, the thing that is coming to mind for me is a recognition of the stories we tell about them, whoever them might be, is just as important as the stories we tell about us. And what I'm hearing about this note of really doing the internal work of being curious requires us to think about, as you mentioned, if we're hearing a certain story or a certain angle of information, to be curious and about other perspectives, because what we see depends on where we're standing. And if we are standing from another location, we're seeing something totally different. It's a different perspective. And that internal work of being curious, I think that's all really connected to this essential value that we keep uplifting in this conversation, which is human dignity and resisting dehumanization, because that's not only the work we do for ourselves, it's also the work we do amongst each other. This is a perfect segue into thinking about practical tips and tools. Marium and Zack, you uplift a lot of conflict resolution tools in your trainings and in your work. Share some of that with us today.
I realized that I was muted the whole time. I'm so sorry. So we think it's really important that, yes, we can present history, we can present information, all of which is needed for you to understand what's happening today, get a greater, broader perspective. We want everybody to walk away with at least some tools in how to have a conversation. So these are 8 things that we had put together that we felt through our studies and our work that he and I have done, that are really important when coming into conflict. And of course, the most important and the one that we probably do the most unsuccessfully is active listening. And that's really just listening to what people are saying. And I challenge all of you, in that your conversations moving forward, see how much you are listening to and how much you're taking in, or are you just waiting for your turn to talk? And that's what's happening a lot when these arguments and these, especially on social media, is that no one's really listening. We're in our echo chambers, or we're going outside of it to just have a fight with somebody and to prove my point. But that, can we have a conversation where we use respectful language, or we seek common ground and we try to build that. I know fact checking is one of the harder things to do, especially right now with AI and deep fakes. But there is putting an effort into it. I think finally also is I statements. I'm sure most people here probably understand that terminology, but if you don't, the idea is when you're having a conversation, changing it so it's your opinion and your perspective. So I believe this, I think this, I want this, instead of you're doing this, or they're doing this, and that othering we were talking about. It just helps to then just personalize it, and you're taking the onus too then about your feelings and experiences. I know this is not easy, but anyways, these are some 8. But there is one more thing that Zack is going to talk about that we think is really important as well when dealing with conflict resolution.
Yeah, somatic healing, or what's happening in the body, mind, and spirit is really important, because I think we are consuming a lot of terrible imagery on our WhatsApp groups, on Instagram. I have a student was scrolling so much and seeing so much death in Gaza, that it started affecting their everyday life, and they became very, very, very depressed. And I think for those of us that are trying to make a difference in this crazy world that we're in, it can really deplete us. And so how do we get back in touch with our body, and maybe take a break from Instagram? How do we get out into nature? How do we do that yoga class? How do we do that breathing when we're in a discussion with someone we really disagree with? How do we not, bite their head off? And how do we get in touch with our own selves? I remember an old video of a Black Lives Matter activist talking to then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, and I practiced. I use this tool now. He was obviously getting triggered by something that she was saying, but he was keeping a calm voice, the Black Lives Matter activist, and he was doing this to his chest, and he was kind of doing circles around his chest. So his argument was more effective, calm, cool, and collected, because he was using a somatic healing tool or tactic, strategy, to stay in his body. And so do the things that you need to do to stay healthy in this moment of deep unwellness.
Anything you'd like to add, Dr. Timothy and Rabbi Stephen?
I would just like to thank Rabbi Stephen for mentioning curiosity, because I think it's so important, and it's so difficult to do that when I'm completely overwhelmed with my own pain and my own perspective. But to have that ability to say, "Oh, wow, that's really hard for me to hear. What do you mean by that?" Right? Like, what does that even mean to you? Because this is what it means to me. To have that sense of curiosity, it means to be taking one another's humanity seriously, right? So, and I think that's important, and I also think it's really important that we stand together, and that we embrace this kind of American social justice anthem, that no one is free until we're all free. I mean, it's long before the American Civil Rights Movement. The Buddhists were teaching pretty much the same thing with the Bodhisattva's vow, the idea that no one can be fully enlightened until everyone is enlightened. And so the idea of standing for one another, we're living in a moment when sympathetic pronouncements for a particular people have been criminalized. People have been fired from jobs. Even Jewish professors have been fired from university tenured positions for having participated in the ceasefire protests on campus. So we're living in a moment. What this should tell us, and I think if I hear you correctly, Stephen, that Stephen's saying that scares him, right? As a Jew, that scares him, even though it's not the Jews who are being targeted here, because you see the seeds of something sinister and widespread in that, and we may very well be witnessing the dawn of a political chapter in this country where that criminalization of standing for the dignity of the other, whoever that other may be, will be increasingly criminalized. And so I think it's really important that we leave this room with a renewed commitment to standing for one another's humanity, full humanity. And that may lead to some very uncomfortable moments for all of us. And I think we have to be ready to embrace that.
Absolutely. The only way that we have ever achieved progress in this country that's lasting and impactful is to be in very uncomfortable coalitions. I think we have this vision. I know in the Jewish community, we always love to harken back to, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching in Selma with the great leaders of the civil rights movement. And we look back as if they all got along with each other. They had deep disagreements. Abolition, suffrage, civil rights, LGBTQ rights, people did not agree with each other 100%, and they often actually deeply disagreed with each other, but they chose to still stay in relationship and stand in coalition. And I think there are moments when our pain is so overwhelming, it is okay for us to say, actually right now I can't have this conversation. Actually right now I need to take care of my heart. But we need to leave the door open. We can't say that's the reason to close the door.
Right.
So when I'm ready, right, when I've taken care of myself, when I've taken a few deep breaths and taken care of my body and my own heart, my community, I'll still be in a relationship with you. There are times it's okay to check out and say, I need to take care of myself first, but we can't let that be an excuse to rupture that relationship. We need to keep that thread still there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And paying attention to how, not only do, for example, our roles change over time in the work that we do, but also, for taking care of ourselves and our feelings and how that changes over time. And to use those as a motivator to make change, whether that's doing the inward internal work within our communities, within our own selves and our own bodies, or that's external work. And a couple of things that are coming to mind as it relates to the themes that you all have shared with the active listening, for example, is that note that we often share when we're facilitating the make space, take space. And paying attention, if you're someone who takes up a lot of space, do some work to make space for other voices to be heard. And vice versa. If you're someone who doesn't want to take up a lot of space and tends to sit back, try to do that work so that your voice and your perspective can be included in the conversation. A naming and a recognition of our privileges and using our privileges as a way to invite others in, as a way to point to stories and voices that are not being heard, that are being silenced, perhaps even being prioritized and legitimized over other voices. And we're seeing that so often in the media, in our social media feeds and what have you. How can we make space for those voices and those perspectives? And the other theme that you shared here at the end is, if we are only talking to people who are on the same page, again, and it's what I said at the very beginning, if we're only talking to people who agree with us, how do we expect to make change? How do we expect to see transformation? And I think that's just so core. So I want to keep us moving and being mindful of time. Invite, if anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll bring them in. But want to invite our speakers here to reflect on what compels you. What compels you to do this work that you are doing? Why are you willing to take on this challenge of engaging across differences? And I know what you said here is that there's differences within your own communities, let alone among other communities. Even in all the frustrations and the heartbreaks of it, have you found beauty and opportunity and spirituality in it? So that's my question to you all. You know, I can start with Zack and Marium, but really all of you. Zack, Zack and Marium, you founded Isma Shema Consulting in this time. What compelled you to do so? Why do you think it's important? And Rabbi Stephen and Dr. Timothy, like, what grounds you theologically in being willing to have these kinds of conversations? And I know you shared a lot of that right now, but just remind us again, uplift. What compels you to do this work and to keep going amidst all the hardship?
I can start and talk about that. Well, for myself, just from a young age, just social justice and activism has always been a part of who I am and who my family is. Going to so many protests and constantly was a thing that we were doing. But I think that two things really shaped it for me. One was when I moved to America when I was 12. So I'm actually Canadian. And it was just at the start of the first Gulf War, and that immediate attention on me as Muslim and the just the ostracization, they really began to start affecting how I was presenting myself and what I was doing in the world. And then the second thing, of course, is 9/11, because I was in the newsroom when it happened, and I could see how coverage was shaping or not shaping, or lies and different things were being told, and then how Muslims were depicted. You know, I've had the pleasure even to work for MPAC and being able to be on the other end of it where you put out statements and stuff. But those two things really kind of pushed me in that I don't want to see this continue. I don't want to see future generations have to deal with what I went through. And that just a little bit of knowledge and understanding can help change that. And then finally, I guess maybe I should say three things in that 10 years ago, Zach and I did a fellowship here in Southern California called New Ground, and it's just based here, but it brings Muslims and Jews together for the purpose of creating relationships and strengthening the two communities. And that fellowship, as many of the hundreds of alum who are part of it will say, absolutely changed my life, really made me have to confront my own anti-Semitism, change, see how these two communities are really so close together that we can be allies and support. And I think that's where I found a lot of strength, is back in my community of New Ground when I hang out with other people who are fellows like we are, because we're thinking the same kind of language. But I'll let Zach answer too.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. My refugee from Europe, and his parents were in Auschwitz, and so hearing stories of how a Black American GI helped my grandmother get safety in the American occupied zone in Bavaria shaped. Wow. Well, if Black folks were treated better in Europe, and then they came back to America and were treated terribly, there are connectivities between these histories of oppression. And so when I teach Jewish history, it's not just about Jewish folks, right? We got to talk about Native American folks, Latinx folks, Black folks, Asian American folks, and Jews of all those shades as well. But I think it's really important, especially the work that Marium and I do. We looked at each other after October 7th and we said, what can we do in this time of mass trauma and death? And we're both bridge builders. And yes, bridges get walked on, so it doesn't always feel good all the time. But it's important work to do. And I'm just thinking, I'm listening to the words being spoken here today. And, the rabbi is right. Heinrich Heine, where they burn books, they burn humans. And so what's happening here? And I also want to say, our other speaker is fantastic in saying, if we're dehumanizing folks in Gaza, we're forgetting our own religion, which, B'Tselem Elohim, we're all made in the image of God. That just doesn't mean this person or this person, but everyone is made in the image of God. And if a lot of the folks in my community are sons and daughters of refugees, and now folks are being made refugees in by a certain government, then we have to call this out and call upon our tradition to think in new and creative ways and more healthy ways. about how to help humanity here.
Go ahead. Do you have an answer?
I always think about the story of the Israelites crossing the wilderness for 40 years, and they're led by some pretty remarkable individuals: Moses, Marium, Aaron. And the thing about those three is that they actually never get to their destination. Moses actually dies, like on at the Jordan River, like seeing so close where he wanted to go, yet not being able to actually cross that boundary. And as a Jew, I'll say also as a queer man, I stand on the shoulders of a lot of Moses's and Aaron's and Miriam's, people who work so hard for the future that I live in now, which as a queer person, as a Jew, is actually one of the safest and best times to be alive, even if we are faced with so many challenges and so much heartbreak in this moment. I don't think any of us are going to see the future that we want to live in, to be realistic. But what I do hold on to, what keeps me going, is to know that if I keep going as far as I can toward that promised land, that promised vision of a future, that hopefully somebody someday will look back and say, like, thank God, that Moses, that Marium, kept walking and didn't give up, and actually got us a little bit closer to that destination.
Wow. I've been given many privileges in my life. I've spent a lot of time, I've drunk gallons of tea in Palestinian refugee camps. I've drunk coffee on Ben Yehuda in West Jerusalem, which is very much a Jewish Western kind of place within Jerusalem. I've been in many sacred spaces in many different countries. I've been in many places that most Americans won't get to go, and maybe many places that most Americans wouldn't want to go. And I have a responsibility to bear witness to the luminosity and the hospitality and the beauty of those experiences and those places, and the people, most importantly, the people with whom I've journeyed into those spaces. I'm also the father of 5 children. I was once asked by a US security border guard as I was coming in from Canada to participate in a interfaith retreat with Dharma masters and swamis and rabbis. And like, what's the point? Like, the world is a mess. And the only thing I could tell him was that, well, look, I have 5 children. And the only thing I'll be able to do is to let them know when I'm leaving this world that at least I tried. I tried to make this world a little bit better for you. And there are many heroic examples of people who stood in uncomfortable places and were proud. Muhammad Ali, whose best friend was Billy Crystal, who gave the best eulogy at his funeral, who marched with the indigenous peoples, who marched with, for him, every human being really was created in the image of God, and he lived accordingly. Every human being in his life was valued and important, and everyone who ever met him has a Muhammad Ali story. I was waiting tables when the champ came into the restaurant, and I'll never forget what he said to me. And the privilege of having known him, the privilege of having worked with him and served him as he prepared for his final statement to the people of planet Earth is another one of those privileges. And that is his funeral. It was another one of those privileges. But I think I'll end with citing my favorite Jewish mystic from the 20th century, a mystic who has been taken in all kinds of unwholesome and political directions, but whose core mystical vision, I think, remains beautiful and unsullied by the people who took his vision into other places. And that's Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. Rav Kook reminds us that no matter how small or insignificant a holy act may be, that it generates these holy sparks, and the reverberations will be felt throughout the cosmos. So there is no way for us to say that what we did today has no significance. There's no way for us to say that what we're doing now will not alleviate the suffering of someone across the world, because we're not in control of those holy lights and those holy sparks. And the one thing that we can say is that some sparks have been generated today. And we have to just have faith that no matter how small or insignificant our efforts may be, that they matter. They matter on some cosmic, mystical scale that we can't even begin to fathom. And so my words of consolation at the end of our conversation today are, what's coming up for me are the words of Rav Kook in his beautiful book on the lights of penitence, where he reminds us that the moment we turn back toward light, toward that which is life-giving, the universe rejoices. And the reverberations of that act, we can't even begin to evaluate or to measure. And I just have to trust that somehow, some way, what we have done today is now lifted into that ether and will have some kind of effect, not only in our lives, but in the lives of people we may never have the privilege of meeting.
Thank you. Yes. And this is that power of faith. You know, I want to add, as we come to a close, what compels me as someone who is neither Jewish or Muslim, that really what impacts, it's really the ethos of shoulder to shoulders work. What impacts one impacts all. And dehumanizing others dehumanizes myself. And a real recognition of that core value that has brought up multiple times throughout this conversation, which is human dignity. You know, the title of this event was How Do We Find the Words? And there were some really beautiful words spoken. There was a question here at the end in the chat, again, uplifting the limitations, which I shared at the very beginning, the limitations of words and these terms, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And, you know, we didn't really go into that deeply, but I know that all of our respective organizations can be resources to point you towards what to go deeper on that. You know, and we as an organization, you know, focus specifically on Islamophobia, but I know Project Isma Shema focuses on both. We also have tools for both at Shoulder to Shoulder, among other organizations in our greater ecosystem. So that's the word I want to close us with, to stay connected to all these organizations and these leaders. You know, if you're not already, make sure that you're on the Center for Christian Muslim Engagement for Peace and Justice at Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. Make sure that you're on the email list for the Interreligious Institute at Chicago Theological Seminary. Sign up for Shoulder to Shoulders list. Sign up for Project Isma Shema's list. Pay attention to what American Islamic College is doing and sign up for their lists. Maybe there's a class you'd like to take to continue in your learning. And just a real recognition to close that we all have a role to play. No matter who we are, no matter where we stand, no matter what our identities are or the perspectives that we might have in this current moment, we all have a role to play. That role changes over time depending on our context, depending on where we stand, how we're feeling. And I just hope that you feel that agency and that desire to act and make change, whatever that change looks like for you and the circles that you occupy. Thank you again to our hosts. And thank you so much to our speakers who shared so beautifully with us. Real privilege to be a part of this conversation. And please know that this is not the end. There is so much more that we can do. So be in touch with us. We're here for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, for that. That's fantastic.
Thank you to Nina for moderating, and thank you to everybody for coming. This was recorded, and if anybody wants that recording, it'll be on our website sometime soon, probably on CTS and AIC's also. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, go Hi, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Samantha.
No.
Okay.